At 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, Carl Brenner, a 21-year-old farm boy from rural Missouri, crouched in a concrete bunker overlooking a wide stretch of sand the world would soon know as Omaha Beach. He had never aimed a gun at another human being before that day. That morning changed everything. Carl's bunker was designated Resistance Nest 62, one of 15 fortified outposts built into the Atlantic Wall. He had been stationed there 3 months earlier, helping dig trenches, lay barbed wire, and position machine guns, like the MG-42 he now manned. He knew every inch of that beach, where the tide came in, where the rocks began, where men would naturally bunch up into target zones carefully mapped by his officers. Through the fog, he watched the horizon fill with ships, first dozens, then hundreds, eventually thousands. Commanders had promised him that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable. They said the Americans were soft, spoiled, untrained for real war. They were wrong. His lieutenant, Bernard Kruger, had reminded them the night before, if the invasion came, it had to be stopped on the beach itself. Field Marshal Rommel had said the first 24 hours would decide the war. If the Allies broke through, it was over. Nothing prepared Carl for what followed. What he saw that day, and what thousands of German soldiers would witness across the front, would shatter everything they thought they knew about their enemy. It wasn't just a battle, it was a revelation. But the story didn't begin in France. It started a year and a half earlier, under the burning sun of North Africa. In February 1943, the Africa Corps believed they were unbeatable. These were veterans, battle-tested against British forces across Libya and Egypt. Their commander, General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was a living legend. They'd fought through hellish sandstorms, engaged in brutal tank battles, and pushed within striking distance of the Suez Canal. When news arrived that American troops had landed in North Africa under Operation Torch, the Germans laughed. To them, these were amateurs. One corporal from the 15th Panzer Division wrote home, "We smashed over 90 of their tanks. They're nothing but a joke." But this arrogance wasn't just battlefield pride. It came from deep-rooted beliefs. German propaganda had long painted Americans as lazy, money-obsessed, weakened by diversity, and incapable of discipline. Then came the Battle of Kasserine Pass. In mid-February 1943, Rommel's forces crashed into unprepared American lines. Over 6,000 U.S. casualties followed, hundreds killed, thousands wounded or captured. Tanks burned across the hills, infantry scattered, communication failed. Some soldiers had barely finished training. Rommel studied the disorganized lines and dismissed the Americans as hopeless. But on day 4, something changed. The artillery, which had been scattered and weak, suddenly struck with precision. The infantry, which had panicked early on, regrouped and fought back. What looked like a complete collapse turned into a measured, controlled retreat. On February 22nd, Rommel did something no one expected. He ordered a withdrawal, not because he lost, but because the Americans refused to break. In his notes, Rommel admitted, "Their defensive tactics were first class. They recovered quickly and stopped our advance." That phrase, "recovered quickly," would haunt German officers throughout the war. In the American rear, changes happened fast. General Frendendahl was replaced with George Patton. Omar Bradley came in to help. Units were reorganized, training intensified, artillery coordination drastically improved. The U.S. Army had learned, and they'd learned fast. Only 5 weeks later, at the Battle of El Guitar, American troops held firm against another German assault. Artillery decimated German tank columns. Infantry stood their ground. The Germans pulled back, empty-handed. That kind of adaptation stunned the Germans. Their army ran on tradition and strict doctrine, but the Americans were different. They dropped what didn't work and picked up what did, whether it came from the British, the Germans, or their own hard-earned mistakes. By May 1943, it was over in North Africa. Trapped between British and American forces, over 260,000 Axis troops surrendered. Among them were many who had once mocked the Americans. But the real wake-up call came a year later. Now back at Omaha Beach, Karl Brenner sat behind his MG-42 with several hundred meters of sand ahead of him. Through his scope, he saw the first wave of American soldiers moving through the surf. And something in him shifted. These were not the panicked greenhorns from Tunisia. These were seasoned, determined men, backed by the full weight of American steel, industry, and will. And Karl, like many others, realized this war would not be won easily.
As the first landing crafts emerged through the morning fog, Karl Brenner squeezed the trigger and didn't let go for hours. His hands gripped an MG-42, one of the fastest and deadliest weapons in the war. It roared with such ferocity that individual shots blurred into a constant, deafening growl. Below him, American troops were crossing an open stretch of beach with no cover and nowhere to run. There was only wet sand, crashing surf, and men falling, one after another. Karl later estimated he fired off over 12,000 rounds that day. He wore out barrel after barrel as they overheated. His hands blistered, his ears rang, and the bunker stank of burnt gunpowder. He kept firing until the machine gun ran dry, then grabbed his rifle and kept shooting. He kept going until the Americans finally broke through, forcing his retreat. That beach, what Americans would call Omaha, has been written about countless times, but what Karl saw from the German side painted a different picture, one not of glory, but of disbelief. From behind his weapon, he watched wave after wave of U.S. soldiers fall. He saw bodies wash back with the tide, and yet they kept coming. That's what stunned German soldiers across the coastline. The Americans never stopped. Landing crafts were blown apart. More arrived. Men were gunned down. Others charged forward to take their place. Entire units were erased, and new ones came ashore to pick up the fight. A German radio operator stationed in a nearby position later said no one believed the invasion would come that night. The skies were cloudy, the wind strong. But when the air suddenly filled with planes, something shifted. Paratroopers dropped, gliders landed, and by morning, a navy stretched across the horizon. It was the last transmission his unit managed before being overwhelmed. Radios jammed, cables cut, command broke down, chaos set in. That radio man was eventually captured. Seeing the scale of what the Allies brought ashore, he said only one thing. At first I was crushed, captured within hours. But when I saw their logistics, I could only think, old man, you got lucky. Another officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, stationed near Karl's position, described the shock. We were told Americans couldn't fight, but they crossed that beach right into our fire. We killed them by the dozens, and they still came. No soldier who lived through that could keep hating such an enemy. The scale of the invasion itself was part of the psychological blow. Looking out across the channel, German soldiers saw something that defied reason, a floating city of ships. Hours after the first wave landed, Allied supply depots began forming right on the beach. One captured German soldier passing by the crates and machines muttered a line that would be repeated by Allied logistics officers for years. Now I understand how you beat us. You piled up your supplies and then just let them fall on us. He wasn't wrong. The war in Europe was, in many ways, a battle of resources, and America fought that war like no one else could. Within 48 hours of landing, more than 130,000 Allied troops were ashore. By the end of the week, that number had more than doubled. They didn't have a port, so they built one. Using old ships as breakwaters, floating concrete blocks and steel pontoons, they created a harbor where none had ever existed. These mulberry harbors were engineering miracles. Bridges rose and fell with the tides. Floating roads connected beach to sea. Within days, the French coast had a working port. German officers who'd fought across France, North Africa, and Russia, men who understood the importance of logistics, watched in disbelief. How do you fight that? How do you stop an enemy that builds ports out of waves and steel? Compared to that, the German supply chain looked medieval. The Wehrmacht still depended heavily on horses for transport. Their vehicles were a mismatched patchwork of German, Italian, French, and British machines, each needing different spare parts they could never find. German soldiers often went hungry. Meanwhile, Americans seemed to have food, fuel, and ammunition by the ton. Their supply depots were overflowing, rations with chocolate, cigarettes, bandages, replacement parts. It wasn't just the gear that shocked the Germans. It was how the Americans fought after the beach. In the thick hedgerows of Normandy, American infantry tactics evolved so fast it spooked seasoned German officers. Units that had faltered in the first days began changing how they moved and fought. They cleared dense terrain with new tools and strategies. They grouped tanks, infantry, and engineers together in combined arms teams. They learned to call in devastating artillery and airstrikes with precision. The countryside around places like Béziers was a defender's dream. Ancient hedgerows, thick enough to stop tanks and hide machine gun nests. Each field was a death trap. The Germans knew it and built interlocking kill zones to bleed the Americans dry. And at first it worked. American losses were heavy. Their tactics, built for open terrain, failed in the tight hedgerows. But then someone got an idea. Take the steel obstacles the Germans had planted on the beaches, weld them to Sherman tanks, and turn them into plows. These converted tanks could slice through the hedgerows instead of climbing over them and exposing their underbellies to anti-tank fire. Within weeks, hundreds of tanks were modified. Infantry units evolved too. Small team leaders developed ambush clearing tactics. Artillery observers honed methods for pinpoint strikes. Combat engineers learned to blast open lanes through the toughest defenses. Air support adapted to fly close to friendly lines with frightening accuracy. German troops watched, alarmed. They were used to fighting enemies that needed months to change tactics. The British, for example, adjusted slowly. But the Americans, they were different. Ideas spread quickly. What one squad learned, an entire battalion used the next day. The U.S. Army was learning as a single living body. Field Marshal Rommel, overseeing the defense of Normandy, saw it clearly. In a report to Berlin, he wrote, "The enemy's overwhelming artillery strength and even greater air superiority have torn through the front." But it wasn't just about numbers. The coordination was unlike anything they'd seen. American fire control centers could direct multiple batteries onto one target so that every shell landed within seconds. No warning, no escape. Veteran German officers spoke of that artillery with quiet reverence. It was precise, it was endless, it was terrifying. One officer recalled lying in a trench as the barrage fell for hours, unable to move, unable to fight back, just waiting, either for it to end or for the next shell to land right on top of him. By the time the American artillery battalions brought in those little Piper Cub planes, bare bones, spotters circling silently overhead, German troops began to flinch. If you saw one of those tiny birds above you, it meant your time was running out. It meant somebody with a map and a radio was watching, and the sky was about to fall. Some German soldiers feared those slow-moving planes more than tanks or infantry. American firepower didn't just hit hard, it hit smart.
fighter bombers patrolled behind enemy lines, shredding anything that moved. Convoys vanished on back roads. Supply trains never made it out of their stations. The Luftwaffe was barely a shadow by this point, so German reinforcements had to travel by night, hiding by day. Deliveries that were supposed to take hours stretched into days. Fuel and ammunition were blown up before ever reaching the front. For all their training and experience, German soldiers felt like they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Meanwhile, the Americans came at them with what seemed like endless fuel, steel, and men. But it wasn't just the firepower that shook German confidence, it was the way Americans used it. Veterans of battles against the British, French, and Soviets noticed something peculiar about the Americans. They fought mean. A former Wehrmacht officer later said the Brits were cautious and calculated, slow but deliberate. The Soviets were brave but blunt. But the Americans? They were aggressive in a way no one expected. If the Americans got hit, they didn't just dig in and defend, they hit back, hard. First came a punishing wall of artillery or a sudden barrage from the skies, and before the dust could settle, their infantry was already charging. That combination, overwhelming fire followed by immediate assault, was unlike anything the Germans had seen. They weren't used to that tempo. American forces didn't wait to secure ground or build up reserves. They attacked fast, adapted even faster, and just kept moving forward. Where other armies paused to regroup, the Americans barely broke stride. Even heavy losses didn't slow them down. They'd take a blow that would stop most armies cold and press on. That resilience unnerved German defenders. Many compared it to facing a wave that just wouldn't quit crashing. It wasn't just persistence, it was pace. The Americans never stopped coming. One attack blended into the next. Even experienced German units were pushed to the brink, their strength bleeding away day after day. And yet something else stood out to them, something strange. The same soldiers who came in swinging, brutal in combat, were almost gentle outside of it. Prisoners of war were treated with care, civilians too. German troops had been told American soldiers were cruel and vengeful, but the men who captured them offered chocolate and cigarettes. Some even shared their rations and medical supplies. That contrast confused many. They expected barbarians. Instead, they got soldiers who followed the Geneva Conventions and showed mercy. American officers ate with their men, joked with them, treated them like equals, not like pawns. That kind of casual, open leadership was alien to German military culture, where rigid ranks ruled all. But somehow it worked. It bred initiative, it bred trust, and it bred a kind of determination that was hard to break. This dual nature, the fierce fighter and the decent victor, shattered the image German propaganda had painted. The myth of the spoiled, weak American was dead. Reality had taken its place. By December 1944, German forces were being pushed back toward their own borders. In a desperate attempt to flip the war on its head, Hitler launched one final offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine. His target? The Ardennes forest. It was the same route the Germans had used to crush France in 1940. Now the goal, split the Allied lines, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. It was a bold gamble, and most of his own generals thought it was suicide. Field marshals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model warned that the army lacked the manpower and resources. Model allegedly told his staff the plan had a 1 in 10 chance of working, but Hitler wouldn't hear it. He wanted the attack. And so, on December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks stormed across a quiet 85-mile stretch of forest where the Americans had least expected it. The timing was deliberate. Thick fog and snowfall grounded Allied aircraft, the same air power that had crushed German hopes in Normandy. For a moment, it looked like the old German discipline and surprise tactics might win out. Entire American units were caught off guard. Some were wiped out. The 106th Infantry Division, one of the least experienced, lost 2 full regiments, over 7,000 men, in one of the worst mass surrenders in U.S. Army history. The Germans used every trick. They sent commandos dressed in American uniforms to sabotage roads, switch signs, and sow confusion. For a moment, the old German belief returned. Maybe, just maybe, the Americans would break. But then came Bastogne. The town sat at the crossroads of 7 key roads. Without it, the German advance would stall. They surrounded it and demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent a single-word reply: nuts. That answer echoed everything the Germans had slowly learned about their enemy over the past 2 years. The Americans didn't quit. They didn't give up ground. You could shoot them, you could surround them, but you could not make them stop fighting. Inside Bastogne, the situation was grim. The 101st Airborne Division had been rushed in, low on food, short on ammo, with wounded stacked in makeshift hospitals. The snow never let up. The town was surrounded, and still they held. When German attacks pressed in, the paratroopers pushed them back. When they ran out of bullets, they scrounged weapons from the dead and kept shooting.
When artillery support seemed impossible, American forward observers still found ways to call in fire from guns that should never have hit their targets. The defense was creative, tenacious, and relentless. On December 26th, General George Patton's Third Army finally fought its way into Bastogne. Reinforcements had covered more than 150 miles. That march, done in just a few days, became one of the most remarkable displays of American logistics and leadership of the entire war. At a vital crossroads, small engineer and infantry teams held choke points against German assaults, burning or moving precious fuel so it wouldn't fall into tanks that already suffered critical shortages. Then, in a stunning reversal, American artillery that had been scattered and uncoordinated earlier suddenly became deadly. On the Elsenborn Ridge in the northern Ardennes, American units concealed nearly 350 guns and created what German soldiers began to call a steel wall. The 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's elite armored force, literally ran into it. Their advance, when the fog finally lifted on December 23rd, American air power entered the battle. The effect was devastating. German tanks, trucks, and troops that had moved freely under cloud cover suddenly found themselves under a storm of bombs and rockets. Fuel depots, already desperately low, were destroyed on the roads. The offensive, which relied on speed and momentum, stalled. Waves of fighter bombers swarmed everywhere. P-47 Thunderbolts loaded with bombs and rockets hammered German armor columns. C-47 transports dropped supplies into besieged Bastogne. Medium bombers struck supply dumps and rail lines. The sky that had shielded the German attack now became its greatest enemy. German soldiers who had tasted Allied air power in Normandy knew exactly what that meant. The window of opportunity was closing. Without fuel, tanks turned into steel coffins. Without ammunition, artillery grew silent. Without supplies, men starved and froze. Fuel shortages became critical. Tank crews drained fuel from one vehicle to try to keep another moving. Others abandoned their machines entirely, unable to fill their tanks. By the end of the fighting, the 116th Panzer Division had no operational tanks left, not because they were destroyed in combat, but because they simply had nothing to run on. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes offensive was over. German losses topped 100,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Worse still, the Wehrmacht had burned through its last reserves. There would be no more major offensives, only retreat. The human cost on both sides was staggering. American casualties exceeded 80,000, including more than 19,000 killed.
It was the bloodiest battle in U.S. Army history. But where the Americans could replace their losses, the Germans could not. Men, tanks, fuel, ammunition, everything expended in the Ardennes was gone for good. British Prime Minister Churchill called the Battle of the Bulge the greatest American engagement of the war. The German soldiers who survived it came to a different conclusion. They had faced an army that could take a crushing surprise attack, stabilize its lines, and counterattack with overwhelming force, all within weeks. When one German tank commander was asked what he thought of modern American soldiers, his answer was blunt. "What's the point of all this? I've got a wife and kids." His question contained its own answer. Against an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources, unwavering resolve, and a proven ability to recover from defeat, further resistance was pointless. By the spring of 1945, German units were surrendering in unprecedented numbers. In the Ruhr pocket alone, more than 317,000 Axis troops were captured, twice what American intelligence had expected. Many Germans actively sought out American units to surrender to, preferring U.S. captivity over being taken by the Soviets. The Ruhr pocket became a death knell for the German army in the West. American and British forces encircled the industrial heart of Germany, trapping nearly 350,000 soldiers. Day after day, loudspeakers urged surrender as the pocket tightened and German supplies and hope ran out. Soldiers made choices based on what they had learned about their enemy. Those captured on the Eastern Front knew what it meant to fall into Soviet hands, horrors and reprisals beyond anything promised by German propaganda. But capture by American forces was different. Word spread through the Wehrmacht that Americans treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, providing food and medical care. They did not execute surrendering men. That knowledge shaped German decisions as the Reich collapsed. Units fought desperately westward, trying to reach American lines instead of Soviet ones. Men crept across battlefields with hands raised, dropping their weapons before they crossed into American positions. Entire officers negotiated the surrender of divisions. The contrast with the Eastern Front was chilling. Against the Soviets, German soldiers fought like men with nothing to lose, knowing that capture could mean death or the Gulag. Against the Americans, surrender became a rational choice. Better to live on in an American POW camp than die in hopeless combat. When one German soldier was asked why he surrendered so readily, he said what many felt. "We should have thought about some of this before the war, especially before we attacked the Russians. But when the choice came, I was glad to give up to the Americans."